Miranda Cole did not look up from her tablet when she spoke. "Pack your things, Mr. Harris. You're done here." Jacob Harris stood in the glass conference room 12 floors above the city, certain he had misheard. He had given this company 6 years. "I won't have a broke single father standing next to my brand," she said. "It's not the image we sell." He said nothing. He gathered his badge, set it on the table, and walked out in silence. 2 weeks later, a Rolls-Royce stopped outside her building. The door opened. Jacob stepped out. The morning Jacob Harris was fired had started like any other. He had arrived at the Cole Dynamics Tower at 7 before the lobby filled the way he had for the better part of 6 years. He liked the quiet hour. He liked the building when it still belonged to no one, when the floors were empty, and the screens were dark, and the work was just work. He was not a loud man. People who met him assumed he was younger than his 41 years, until they looked at his eyes, which carried the steadiness of someone who had survived more than he advertised. He kept his head down. He solved problems other people couldn't, and he never asked for credit. In a company that ran on noise, Jacob ran on results. He had built the architecture behind half of Cole Dynamics' core platform, not the part with his name on it, because his name was never on anything but the part that worked when everything else failed. When a server farm went dark at 2 in the morning, they called Jacob. When a client threatened to walk, they sent Jacob into the room. He fixed things. That was what he did, and for a long time he had believed that was enough. He lived small on purpose. He drove a 9-year-old sedan, he packed his own lunch, and he wore the same 3 jackets in rotation. People in the office mistook this for poverty, and Jacob never corrected them. Let them think what they wanted. He had learned a long time ago that the loudest men in the room were usually the emptiest, and the quietest ones were the only people you could trust with the truth. What none of them knew, what Miranda Cole certainly did not know, was that money had stopped being Jacob's problem some years earlier. He simply chose not to spend it the way the rest of them did. That choice was tied to a man named Daniel Reeves. Years before Cole Dynamics, before any of this, Jacob and Daniel had shared a cramped apartment and a single broken idea between them. Daniel had the vision and the charm. Jacob had the hands that made things real. They had built something in a garage that nobody believed in, and when the money ran out, Jacob did the only thing that made sense. He took a stable job. He went to work for other people. He let the dream become Daniel's problem to carry, but he had never sold his share. That was the part everyone forgot. When the others bailed, Jacob signed nothing away. He kept his piece of the company quietly, the way he kept everything quietly, and over the years, that piece had grown into something he rarely looked at and never discussed. He had not told a single person at Cole Dynamics, not because it was a secret he treasured, but because it had never seemed relevant. He came here to work. He liked the work, and a man who loves the work does not need to remind anyone that he could walk away whenever he wanted. That was the version of Jacob Harris who stepped into the elevator that morning, holding a paper cup of coffee, thinking about a problem he wanted to finish before lunch. The summons came at 10. A 2-line message from Miranda Cole's assistant asked him to come to the 12th floor conference room. Jacob assumed it was about the migration project. He brought his tablet and his notes. He even brought ideas. Miranda Cole was already seated when he arrived, framed by the glass wall and the gray city behind it. She was the kind of executive who had learned that silence was a weapon and used it constantly. She wore success the way other people wore perfume, in a way you couldn't ignore even when you tried. She did not offer him a seat. She did not look up. "Pack your things, Mr. Harris. You're done here." Jacob set his coffee down slowly. For a moment, he genuinely believed he had walked into the wrong meeting, that some other Harris was about to lose his job, and the assistant had made an error. He waited for the correction. It didn't come. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think I misheard you." "You didn't." Now she looked at him, and there was nothing in her face he could appeal to. "Your position is being eliminated, effective immediately." He stood very still. 6 years moved through his mind in a single quiet rush. The nights, the rescues, the rooms he had saved. He searched her expression for a reason and found only a decision that had already been made somewhere far above this conversation. "Can I ask why?" he said. He watched her weigh whether he was even worth an answer. In the end, she gave him one, and it was worse than no answer at all. "Because you don't fit," Miranda said. "I'm building something here, a brand, an image, and a broke single father in a 9-year-old car does not belong in the picture I'm selling to investors. It's nothing personal, Mr. Harris. It's optics." The word landed somewhere deep and cold. Optics. 6 years of work reduced to a flaw in a photograph. He thought about all the times he had stayed until dawn so that her name could shine in the morning, and he understood with a terrible clarity that to her he had always been furniture. Useful furniture until the room was being redecorated. A different man might have argued. A different man might have listed his accomplishments, named the projects, demanded to speak to the board. Jacob felt all of that rise in his chest, the hot, righteous instinct to defend himself. And then he let it go, because he knew something she didn't, and because the deepest kind of strength is the kind that refuses to be drawn into a fight it has already won. Arguing would have meant begging. Begging would have meant handing her the last thing he owned in that room, which was his dignity. He was not going to do that. Not for her. Not for any of them. "All right," he said. Miranda blinked. She had clearly prepared for a scene, and the absence of one seemed to unsettle her more than any outburst would have. "That's it," she said. "No questions. You've answered the only one that mattered." He picked his badge off the lanyard around his neck, and the small, mechanical click of it releasing was the loudest sound in the room. He set it on the glass table in front of her, square, deliberate, like a man placing the final piece of a game he had decided to stop playing. "Good luck with the optics," he said. He walked out without looking back. The floor outside the conference room had gone quiet in the way offices do when something has happened, and everyone is pretending it hasn't. Heads tilted just slightly toward him as he passed. Karen Mills, who had worked 2 desks down from him for 3 years and had once cried at her own desk over a project Jacob quietly fixed for her overnight, would not meet his eyes. He did not blame her. Fear was contagious in places like this, and the safest thing anyone could do was act as though Jacob Harris had already stopped existing. He gathered his things into a single cardboard box, a spare charger, a photo in a plain frame that he turned face down before anyone could see it, a coffee mug. 6 years fit into a container he could carry under one arm, and that fact alone told him everything he needed to know about how much he had truly belonged here. In the elevator down alone, he allowed himself one long breath. His hands were steady. That surprised him. He had expected to feel destroyed, and instead he felt something stranger and colder, a clarity he had not felt in years. Somewhere under the shock, a part of him that had been asleep for a very long time was beginning to wake up. The lobby doors opened onto the street, and the noise of the city rushed back in. Jacob stood on the sidewalk, a man who had just been erased from a building he had helped to build, and he did the only thing that felt honest. He laughed. Quietly. Just once. Because Miranda Cole had fired him for being too small for her picture, and she had no idea, none at all, how badly she had just misjudged the size of the man she had thrown away. He drove home in the 9-year-old sedan she had used as evidence against him. The car ran fine. It had always run fine. That was the point of it. He had never needed people to see his worth in the metal he drove, and he had let that habit become a kind of armor, never imagining it would one day be used to cut him. His apartment was clean and spare, the home of a man who did not waste motion or money. He set the box down on the counter and stood in the silence of his own kitchen, and the full weight of the day finally arrived. Not grief exactly. Something heavier and quieter. The feeling of having given the best years of your effort to people who measured you by the wrong scale and found you lacking on purpose. He did not call anyone. There was no one to call who would understand, and the people who might have pretended to understand were the same people who had refused to look at him an hour ago. So he sat with it. He let himself feel the full insult of it, because he had learned that the only way past a thing was straight through the center of it. For 2 days, he barely left the apartment. He told himself he was resting. In truth, he was deciding who he was going to be on the other side of this. There was an easy version of revenge available to him, and he knew it. He could have made some calls and burned Miranda Cole's careful little picture to the ground before the week was out. The thought was satisfying in the way that poison is satisfying. He let himself imagine at every detail the panic on her face, the apology she would be forced to make. And then he set it aside, because anger that moves too fast makes mistakes, and Jacob Harris did not make mistakes. He made plans. On the 3rd day, he opened his laptop and did something he had not done in nearly 2 years. He logged into an account he rarely touched and looked for the first time in a long while at exactly what he owned. The number on the screen did not feel real. He had known in an abstract way that the company he and Daniel had started had grown. He had seen the headlines the way anyone sees headlines about a thing they used to be part of. But he had never sat with the figure attached to his own name, and now that he did, he understood that the man Miranda Cole had called a broke single father could have bought a meaningful piece of Cole Dynamics itself without noticing the dent. He closed the laptop and stared at the wall for a long while. It would have been easy to feel vindicated. He didn't. Not entirely. The number didn't erase the morning in the conference room. Money never erased anything. It only changed what you could do about it. And what Jacob wanted was not money. He already had that. What he wanted was harder to name, and it had something to do with the way Miranda had said the word optics as though he were a stain. He wanted them to understand. Not to be hurt exactly, but to understand. To know with absolute certainty that they had thrown away something they had never bothered to see clearly. There is a particular kind of justice in being underestimated by people who believe themselves to be the smartest in the room, and Jacob was beginning to feel the shape of that justice forming in his hands. He picked up his phone and called Daniel Reeves for the first time in months. Daniel answered on the 2nd ring, his voice warm and surprised. "Jacob Harris, I was starting to think you'd changed your number." "Daniel," Jacob said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to take it seriously." There was a shift on the other end of the line, the sound of a friend hearing a tone he recognized. "I'm listening." "How much of the company is still mine?" A recalculation rather than a hesitation. "All of it," Daniel said. "Every share you ever held. You never signed a thing away. Remember, I kept asking you what you wanted to do with it, and you kept telling me you'd deal with it later. So I left it alone." His voice softened. "Why are you asking me this now? What happened?" Jacob looked at the cardboard box still sitting on his counter, 6 years compressed into a thing he could lift with one arm. "I got fired," he said. 3 days ago. They told me I didn't fit the image." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was something hard underneath the warmth. "Who's they?" "Cole Dynamics. Miranda Cole." Daniel let out a low whistle. "Cole, I know the name. We've crossed paths with that company more than once." Something in the way he said it made Jacob sit up. "Jacob, do you have any idea who that company has been trying to get into bed with for the last 8 months? Jacob did not answer because he was beginning to suspect, and the suspicion was almost too neat to believe. "Us," Daniel said. "Your company. They've been chasing a partnership with us for the better part of a year. They need what we have to close the round they keep bragging about to their investors. They've been sending us proposals. We've been ignoring most of them." He laughed, and there was no kindness in it. and the man they just threw out the door for not fitting their picture is the second largest shareholder in the company that holds their entire future in its hands. Do I have that right? Jacob stood and walked to the window and looked out over a city that had not changed at all in 3 days, while everything inside him had. You have that exactly right, he said. What do you want to do? Daniel asked. Say the word and I'll bury them. I mean it. One phone call, and there it was, the fast and easy poison offered freely by a friend who would have followed through without blinking. Jacob held the phone and felt the full power of the thing he had been handed, the sheer simplicity of destruction. No, he said at last. I don't want to bury them. Burying them is too quick. They'd never even understand what hit them. Then what? Jacob watched his own faint reflection in the glass, a man in a plain jacket against a gray sky, and for the first time in 3 days, he smiled slowly and without warmth. I want them to invite me back in, he said. I want to walk through that lobby as exactly what they decided I wasn't. And I want Miranda Cole to shake my hand before she has any idea who she's shaking it with. Daniel was silent, and then he laughed, low and delighted. You always did play the long game, Jacob. All right. Tell me what you need. Jacob turned from the window. The box on the counter no longer looked like an ending. It looked like a beginning he had been too modest to claim for far too long. For now, he said, I need you to set up a meeting. Cole Dynamics has been begging for one. Let's finally give them what they want. His voice was calm, even certain. And Daniel, don't tell them my name. Just tell them the partner is coming in person to decide. He hung up and stood alone in his quiet apartment, and understood that the morning he had been erased was the morning his real life had started over. The next move was already clear in his mind. If they wanted an image, he would give them one they would never forget. The rumor moved faster than Jacob had expected. By the 5th day, the story of his firing had been retold so many times inside Cole Dynamics that it no longer resembled what had happened. In some versions, he had been caught stealing. In others, he had broken down and begged. In the version that traveled furthest, he had simply not been good enough, and the company had finally done what it should have done years earlier. Jacob heard pieces of it, the way you hear weather secondhand and unreliable. Karen Mills called him that same evening, her voice tight with guilt, and told him she was sorry that she had wanted to say something in the office and hadn't found the courage. He told her it was all right. He meant it. He understood now that people who are afraid for their own positions cannot afford to be brave for someone else's. And he had stopped expecting them to be. But the call gave him something more useful than an apology. It gave him confirmation. Karen, talking quickly to fill the silence, mentioned that Miranda had been unusually tense all week, that there were closed-door meetings with the board, that a partnership everyone had been promised was suddenly in jeopardy. The investors, she said, were getting impatient. The big round Miranda had been bragging about for months was stalling, and no one seemed to know why. Jacob knew why. He thanked Karen, told her to take care of herself, and hung up with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a machine grind itself down on a problem only he could see clearly. Still, he did not let himself relax. He had learned long ago that the gap between knowing you hold the better hand and actually winning the game is wide enough for a man to fall through. There was work to do, and the work was not glamorous. It was the unglamorous part that most people skipped, which was exactly why most people lost. He spent the rest of the first week and all of the second the way he had spent the best parts of his career, with his head down and his attention total. He pulled every public filing Cole Dynamics had released. He read the terms of the proposals Daniel's company had been ignoring. He studied the structure of the deal Miranda was chasing until he understood it better than the people who had drafted it. He was not preparing to gloat. He was preparing to be the most informed person in any room he chose to walk into. What he found told him a story Miranda had not meant to tell. Cole Dynamics looked powerful from the outside, all glass and confidence, but the foundation was thinner than the brand suggested. The company had overextended on the promise of a partnership it did not yet have. It had spent money it would only earn if a specific deal closed. And the only company in a position to close that deal was the one with Jacob Harris's name on a significant block of its shares. Miranda Cole had built her entire image on top of a future that quietly belonged in part to the man she had thrown out for being too small to photograph. Jacob set the documents aside and sat with that knowledge for a long time. There was a temptation in it, a pull toward the easy and devastating move Daniel had offered. He could simply refuse the partnership. He could let the round collapse. He could sit in his quiet apartment and do absolutely nothing, and watch from a distance as the company that had erased him erased itself. He didn't want that. He kept circling back to why, and the answer was not as noble as he wished it were, but it was honest. He did not want Miranda Cole destroyed by an absence. He wanted her to look him in the face. Destruction from a distance was just abandonment with extra steps, and abandonment was what she had done to him. He wanted something she had denied him in that conference room. He wanted to be seen. Midway through the second week, Daniel called with news that complicated everything. The meeting had been arranged. Cole Dynamics had jumped at the chance the moment Daniel's people reached out, exactly as Jacob had predicted. But there was a wrinkle. Miranda had insisted the meeting happen at the Cole Dynamics tower, on her own floor, in her own conference room. She wanted home advantage. She wanted to receive the partner as a queen receives a supplicant. "She doesn't know it's you," Daniel said. "She thinks she's meeting some faceless representative of the firm. She's planning to charm the room. I've seen the agenda her people sent over. It's a performance, Jacob. She's going to walk in there and try to dazzle the very man she fired." Jacob stood at his window, watching the city move below him. "Good," he said. "Let her perform. Let her use every trick she has. I want her to give the best version of the pitch she's capable of." "Why?" Daniel asked. "You could just walk in and end it." "Because I want her to mean it," Jacob said. "I want her to stand in that room and tell me in her own words exactly how badly she needs this partnership. I want her to look me in the eye and ask for help from the man she decided wasn't worth a reason. And then I want her to find out who she's been asking." Daniel was quiet, and then he said more gently than before, "You've changed. You know that the Jacob I knew would have walked away and never looked back. The Jacob you knew got walked on for 6 years because he thought disappearing was the same as being decent," Jacob said. "I'm done disappearing. Done." But the road to the meeting was not as smooth as Jacob made it sound. The doubts came at night when the apartment was dark, and there was nothing left to read or plan. He would lie awake, and a smaller voice would surface the voice that had kept him quiet and modest and overlooked for most of his life, and it would ask the questions he could not fully answer. What if he was becoming the thing he hated? What if revenge, even patient and elegant? Revenge was just a more sophisticated way of letting Miranda Cole decide who he was. She had reduced him to optics. Was he now reducing himself to a single act of vindication, a man defined entirely by the morning he had been fired? There were other pressures too smaller, but sharp. Daniel's partners were not unanimously thrilled. Some of them had spent months keeping Cole Dynamics at arm's length, precisely because the company seemed unstable. And now Jacob was proposing to walk straight into the center of it, for reasons that looked from the outside suspiciously personal. One of them, a careful man named Walter Briggs, who sat on the board and trusted numbers more than feelings, called Jacob directly 2 days before the meeting. "I'll be honest with you," Briggs said, his voice dry and exact. "I don't like deals that have a man's wounded pride baked into them. Pride makes people pay too much or sell too cheap. So before this goes any further, I need to know which one you are. Are you walking into that room as a shareholder protecting an investment, or as a man who got hurt and wants an audience for it?" It was a fair question, and Jacob respected him for asking it plainly. He took his time before answering, because the honest answer required him to look at himself without flinching. 2 weeks ago it was the second one, Jacob admitted. I won't lie to you. I wanted an audience. I wanted her to suffer in front of me. He looked at the documents spread across his table, the careful work of the last 14 days. But I did the homework, and the homework says this is a real opportunity on the right terms. Their platform plus ours is worth more than either alone. The pride got me into the room. The numbers are what'll keep me there. If the deal doesn't work, I'll walk, and I won't care who's watching. Does that answer it? There was a long silence on the line, the sound of a skeptical man recalibrating. It does, Briggs said finally. Mostly. I'll be there too. And if I think your pride is steering, I'll say so in front of everyone. Fair. Fair, Jacob said, and meant it. That conversation did more for him than any amount of planning. It forced him to separate the two threads he had let tangle together the wound and the opportunity, and to decide which one he would let lead. By the time he hung up, something had settled in him. He would walk into that room as a businessman first. The reckoning with Miranda would be real, but it would be a consequence of the truth, not the purpose of it. He would not let her keep defining him, not even by being the thing he organized his revenge around. It was a quieter resolution than the cold satisfaction he had felt on the third day, and it was stronger for being quieter. The last thing to settle was the entrance, and on that point, Jacob surprised even himself. Daniel had insisted on certain optics of his own. When a major shareholder arrives to finalize a partnership of this size, Daniel argued he does not pull up in a 9-year-old sedan. The other side reads everything. They measure your worth in the first 10 seconds before a word is spoken. Show up small, and they negotiate down. Show up like the future, and they fall in line. Daniel had a car, a Rolls-Royce, that the firm kept for exactly these occasions, and he wanted Jacob to use it. Jacob's first instinct was to refuse. The whole shape of his life had been built around not needing such things. He had let people underestimate the car he drove and had worn their assumptions like armor. To arrive in a Rolls-Royce felt at first like betraying the very thing that made him different from people like Miranda Cole. But the more he sat with it, the more he understood the irony, and the irony changed his mind. Miranda had fired him over a car. She had pointed to 9-year-old metal as proof that he was small, broke unworthy of her picture. The car had been her evidence, so there was a kind of poetry in answering that judgment in the exact language she had used to deliver it. She had measured him by a vehicle. He would simply let her measure him by another one, and discover that the scale she trusted had been lying to her all along. The Rolls-Royce was not a contradiction of who he was. It was a mirror held up to who she was, and Jacob decided he could live with holding that mirror for a single afternoon. Send the car, he told Daniel. The night before the meeting, Jacob laid out a plain, dark suit. Nothing flashy, the suit of a man who did not need his clothes to do his talking. He reviewed his notes one final time, though he no longer needed them. He knew the deal cold. He knew the company's weaknesses and its strengths, knew the exact terms that made sense and the exact lines he would not cross. He was by any measure the most prepared person who would be in that room, and he had earned every piece of that preparation with 2 weeks of unglamorous invisible work. He slept well, which surprised him. The doubts that had circled him for nights had quieted not because they had been answered perfectly, but because he had finally chosen who he was going to be, regardless of them. A man at peace with his own purpose does not lie awake. He had not felt that peace in 6 years, possibly longer. In the morning, he stood at his window with a cup of coffee and watched the Rolls-Royce arrive on the street below. Long and dark and silent, so out of place against the row of ordinary cars that a few pedestrians actually stopped to look. It waited for him with the patient certainty of an object that had never once doubted its own value. Jacob looked at it for a moment, and then at his own reflection in the glass, a man in a plain suit who had spent his whole life refusing to be impressed by the wrong things. He felt no thrill at the luxury of it. He felt only the steady, clear focus of a man walking into a room he had been preparing for his entire career without knowing it. He thought briefly of Karen Mills, who would be somewhere in that building, and of the way the floor had emptied of friends the moment he became inconvenient. He thought of Walter Briggs, who would be watching to see whether pride or numbers steered his hand. And he thought of Miranda Cole, who at this exact moment was somewhere above the city rehearsing a pitch designed to charm a stranger she believed held her company's future in his hands. She was right about that last part. She just had no idea whose hands they were. Jacob set the coffee cup in the sink, washed it, and dried it, because he wasn't the kind of man who left a mess behind him, even on a day like this. He took the plain dark suit jacket from its hanger and put it on. He checked nothing in the mirror because there was nothing left to check. Then he went downstairs and crossed the sidewalk to the waiting car. The driver opened the door without a word. Jacob slid into the quiet leather interior, and the sounds of the street vanished behind the heavy door as it closed. For a moment he simply sat in the silence, the city sliding past the tinted windows. He thought about the version of himself who had ridden the elevator down 2 weeks earlier, with everything he owned under one arm, certain he had been destroyed. That man had been wrong. He had not been destroyed. He had been released. "Coal Dynamics," he told the driver. "The tower on the corner. Take your time. I'm not in a hurry." The car pulled smoothly into traffic, and Jacob Harris rode toward the building that had erased him no longer, the quiet man who let people decide his worth, carrying the one thing Miranda Cole had never thought to ask whether he possessed. He watched the tower grow larger through the windshield 12 floors of glass, catching the morning light, and somewhere up there, a woman was straightening her notes and adjusting her smile, preparing to dazzle the most important guest of her career. The Rolls-Royce slowed as it approached the entrance, where 2 weeks before he had stood on the sidewalk and laughed. The same doors, the same lobby, a different man entirely arriving to walk through them. The car came to a stop. Through the window, Jacob could see the building's front doors, the polished floor beyond the place where his old badge had once granted him entry, and where today he needed no badge at all. He reached for the door handle, and his hand was perfectly steady the way it had been in the conference room, the way it always was now. He had spent 2 weeks earning the right to this moment honestly with research and restraint, and a hard conversation about who he intended to be. The entrance was just theater. The real power had been built quietly, the way he built everything in the hours no one watched. Jacob Harris opened the door of the Rolls-Royce and stepped out onto the sidewalk in front of Coal Dynamics, into the full light of a morning that belonged for once entirely to him. The lobby of Coal Dynamics had not changed in 2 weeks, but Jacob walked through it as though entering it for the first time. The security guard who had checked his badge for 6 years looked up, recognized him, and could not hide the confusion that crossed his face. He glanced from Jacob to the Rolls-Royce idling at the curb and back again, and decided wisely to say nothing. Daniel Reeves was waiting near the elevators, and the 2 men shook hands without ceremony. "She's upstairs," Daniel said quietly. "Whole room set up like a coronation. Walter's already here. He's watching you, by the way. Watching both of us." His mouth twitched. "You ready?" "I've been ready for 2 weeks," Jacob said. Some of it for longer than that. They rode the elevator up together, and Jacob felt the floors pass with a strange calm. The last time he had ridden this car, he had been certain he was finished. Now he carried nothing in his hands at all, and that emptiness felt like the truest kind of power, the kind that needs no props. The conference room doors opened, and the performance began before anyone said a word. Miranda Cole rose from her seat at the head of the long glass table, her smile already in place, polished and warm, and entirely professional. It was the smile she reserved for people she needed. Walter Briggs sat to one side, a thin, watchful man with a notepad and no expression. 2 of Miranda's executives flanked her, arranged like a tableau meant to communicate strength and stability to a guest who held their future. For a fraction of a second, her eyes moved to Daniel, expecting him to introduce the partner. Then they slid to Jacob, and her smile faltered in a way she fought hard to control. Recognition arrived slowly, the way a person recognizes a face entirely out of context, and Jacob watched the exact moment her mind refused to accept what her eyes were telling her. "I'm sorry," Miranda said, her voice still smooth but stretched thin underneath. "I think there's been some confusion. We're expecting a representative from the partner firm." "There's no confusion," Daniel said pleasantly. "Allow me to introduce the second largest shareholder of our company, and the man who'll be deciding whether this partnership happens. I believe the two of you have met." The room went very still. Walter Briggs looked up from his notepad for the first time, his eyes moving between Miranda and Jacob, with the keen interest of a man watching a hypothesis prove itself. Jacob crossed to the table and extended his hand, exactly as he had told Daniel he would. "Miranda," he said evenly, "it's good to see you again." She took his hand because there was nothing else she could do, and he felt the slight tremor in it before she withdrew. The color had left her face. He could see her racing through the last 2 weeks at high speed, recalculating every assumption, arriving again and again at the same impossible conclusion. The broke single father she had thrown out for ruining her picture was the man her entire company had been begging to meet. "You," she began and stopped. She gathered herself with visible effort, lowering back into her chair, gesturing for him to sit, as though she could reclaim control of the room through sheer hospitality. "Please, sit. I think we have a great deal to discuss." Jacob did not sit immediately. He stood at the foot of the table in the plain, dark suit and looked at the room she had arranged to impress a stranger. The flowers, the carefully positioned executives, the view of the city behind her like a backdrop she had purchased. All of it staged to communicate one message: that Coal Dynamics was powerful and stable and worth partnering with, and all of it built on a foundation that quietly belonged in part to him. 2 weeks ago. Jacob said, his voice level and unhurried. "You fired me in a room very much like this one. You told me I didn't fit the image. You said a broke single father in a 9-year-old car didn't belong in the picture you were selling to investors." He let the words sit in the air without dramatizing them. "I didn't argue. I want you to know I never planned to argue. I just want to make sure I understood you correctly because it seems relevant to what we're about to discuss." Miranda's executives shifted uncomfortably. Walter Briggs wrote something on his pad. Miranda's smile was gone entirely, now replaced by the careful blankness of someone who knows they are cornered and is searching for an exit that does not exist. "That was a business decision," she said. "It wasn't personal." "I believe you," Jacob said, and surprised her by meaning it. "That's the part that always bothered me, actually. It wasn't personal. You looked at me and saw a car and a circumstance, and you decided those things were the whole of me. You never once considered there might be more, because it never occurred to you that the quiet man fixing your platform at 2 a.m. could be worth more than the picture you wanted on your wall." He pulled out the chair at last and sat folding his hands on the glass. "Here's what I've spent the last 2 weeks learning, Miranda. Your company looks powerful from the outside. The brand is excellent. But the brand is the only thing holding it up right now. You overextended on the promise of a partnership you didn't have. You told your investors a future was already secured, and that future depends entirely on a deal with the one company in this market positioned to deliver it." He let the silence do its work for a moment. "Mine." Walter Briggs set down his pen. "He's right about the exposure," he said quietly to no one in particular. "I've read the same filings. You're more leveraged than your investors understand." Miranda's eyes flashed to Briggs, then back to Jacob, and Jacob watched the last of her composure thin to the breaking point. The crisis had arrived, and it had arrived wearing the face of the man she had dismissed as furniture. "So, this is what it's about," she said, and there was a bitter edge to her voice, now the sound of someone who has decided to go down fighting. "You came here to humiliate me? You drove up in that car, you walked into my building, and you want to watch me beg. Is that it? You want your audience?" It was the exact accusation Walter Briggs had leveled at him on the phone, and Jacob had spent his days since deciding it would not be true. He looked at Miranda, and for the first time he felt something other than the cold clarity that had carried him here. He felt unexpectedly a kind of pity, because she could only imagine that everyone operated the way she did, that power existed only to be used as a weapon, that being wronged meant nothing except the right to wrong someone in return. "No," he said. "I thought about it. I'll be honest with you because you were honest with me. For about 3 days, that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted you to feel as small as you made me feel. I had the power to do it. One phone call, and I could have let this whole deal collapse, let the round fail, let your investors find out the future you promised them was never yours to give. I could have done it from my apartment without ever seeing your face." He leaned back slightly, "but that would have just made me you. And I've spent my whole life trying not to be the kind of person who measures someone by the smallest thing about them and throws away the rest. So I'm not going to humiliate you, Miranda. I'm not going to make you beg. That would be easy, and it would be cheap, and it would prove your version of the world is the only one that's real. I'd rather prove it isn't." The room was completely silent. Even Daniel, who had expected something sharper, was watching his old friend with something close to respect. "The deal makes sense," Jacob continued, and now his voice shifted into the register of a man discussing business clear and exact. "Your platform and ours are worth more together than apart. The numbers are real. Walter has run them. I've run them, and they hold. So here is what's going to happen. The partnership will proceed on fair terms because it's good business, and because I don't make decisions out of spite." He met her eyes directly. "But it proceeds with conditions, and the conditions are mine." Miranda was silent, watching him, no longer able to pretend she held any cards. "First," Jacob said, "I take a seat at the table on this partnership, not as an employee, as a principal. You'll deal with me as an equal, because that's what I am. And that's what I was the entire time I worked under you, whether you saw it or not. Second, the people in this building who do the real work, the ones who get thrown out for the wrong reasons by people who never bother to look at them, get treated like they matter. I'll be watching for that. And third," he glanced toward the door, beyond which the floor went on with its day, "Karen Mills gets a promotion. She's twice as good as her title, and she's been overlooked for exactly the reasons you overlooked me. Consider it a small correction." Walter Briggs allowed himself the faintest smile and wrote one final note. Miranda Cole sat very still, absorbing the full shape of what was happening. She had walked into this room prepared to charm a stranger into saving her company, and instead, she was being saved by the man she had thrown away on his terms, with her own failure laid bare in front of her board member and her executives. There was no version of this that flattered her, and yet there was no cruelty in it either, and that absence of cruelty was somehow harder to bear than any revenge would have been. "Why," she said finally, and her voice had lost all its polish, "would you help me at all after what I did?" Jacob considered the question because it deserved a real answer. "Because the deal is good, and good deals shouldn't die, because one person made a small decision about another person," he said. "And because the best way I could think of to answer what you said to me wasn't to destroy you. It was to be standing right here in front of you, the exact opposite of everything you assumed I was. You called me small, so I'm going to be the biggest person in this room today, and let you sit with the difference." He stood buttoning his jacket. "That's not revenge, Miranda. It's just the truth finally getting a chance to be seen." He extended his hand a second time, and this time, when she took it, the tremor was gone, replaced by something quieter and more chastened. the grip of a person who has been forced to revise her entire understanding of someone in the space of 20 minutes. "Daniel will handle the paperwork," Jacob said. "Walter, it was good to finally meet you in person. You asked me a fair question, and I hope I've answered it." Walter Briggs rose and shook his hand firmly. "You did," he said. "The numbers steered. I'll note it for the record." There was approval in the dry voice, the rare approval of a man who trusted very little and had just decided to trust this. Jacob walked to the door. Before he reached it, he turned back once. Miranda was still seated smaller now than the room she had built around herself, watching him go, with an expression he had never seen on her before, the look of someone who has just understood far too late the cost of never looking closely, for what it's worth. Jacob said, "The car was never the point. It was never about what I drove. You just couldn't see anything else." And then, without anger, almost gently, "I hope you learn to. It'll save you from doing this to the next one." He left the room. The floor outside was the same floor he had walked 2 weeks earlier, while friends found reasons not to see him. Now those same people turned toward him, and there was no pretending anymore. Word had already traveled the way word always did in that building, and the ones who had been afraid to meet his eyes on his last day now watched him pass with open astonishment. Karen Mills stood near her desk, and when Jacob caught her eye, he gave her the smallest nod. She did not yet know about the promotion. She would learn soon enough, for now she simply looked at him. This man who had been thrown away and had come back not to burn the place down but to walk through it, like he had always belonged. And Jacob saw in her face the dawning understanding that she had just witnessed something she would tell people about for years. He rode the elevator down alone. 12 floors, the same descent, the same car, the same building. But the man who reached the lobby was not the man who had once made this trip believing he was finished. That man had been wrong about everything, except his own worth, and even that he had kept hidden, even from himself. The Rolls-Royce waited at the curb, but Jacob stood for a moment on the sidewalk first, in the same spot where 2 weeks earlier he had laughed once quietly at the size of the misjudgment that had just been made about him. He did not laugh this time. He felt no need to. The thing that had wanted vindication had been quieted not by revenge, but by the simple act of being seen fully and finally on his own terms. He thought about the choice he had made upstairs, the easy and devastating move he had set down for good. He could have destroyed her. It would have felt good for an afternoon, and hollow for years. Instead, he had done the harder thing, which was to prove with his own conduct that a person's worth is not the smallest fact about them, that the man in the old car had always been exactly who he was, regardless of who refused to look. That was the only revenge that had ever mattered, and it was not revenge at all. It was just becoming out loud the man he had been all along. Jacob crossed the sidewalk. The driver opened the door. He paused before getting in, and glanced up one last time at the tower of glass, catching the afternoon light. 12 floors of a place that had once measured him by the wrong scale and found him lacking. He had not come back to take anything from them. He had come back to take back himself. He slid into the quiet leather seat, and the heavy door closed against the noise of the city. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked. Jacob looked out at the street ahead, open and bright and entirely his own. "Forward," he said. "Anywhere forward." The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, and Jacob Harris rode out into the afternoon, no longer the man anyone had thrown away, carrying with him the only thing he had ever truly needed, the world to see which had been there quietly the whole time.